All right. Welcome to the Sweet Science of Finding podcast. We're actually episode 101, which is, it could actually be 102, depends how I label them all, but 101. Today we have two heavyweights, not in terms of size, as we talked about before that, two heavyweights in the ecological dynamic space here. And people that had an issue with my Instagram reel that I posted recently. So we're going to dive into why I'm wrong on that reel, which I love to know, and just keep learning and all that on that space, but also dive into that new paper on the MMA side and kind of get John's perspective on that as well, and Scott being an author on that paper too, to get his perspectives on that, which would be really, really good. So I think I'm going to start this with my reel. I had it up before. Okay, hang on, let me bring it up. I think probably one of the main issues was my very clickbait title or hook on the very front of it. That's social media. I had to do it. I tried to explain a bit in the caption, but regardless, I think, John, you have more to add to what I was trying to say there, or maybe go against everything I had to say there. So why don't we just start there? Let's start with my reel. For the listeners, let me just pick what I actually wrote on the front. Okay. I wrote, why drilling and hitting pads isn't effective. That was my hook. So let's just start there. You just riff, John, and we'll go through.
I thought your reel did the job. In fairness, James, it's good to see you guys again. Before I say anything, it's good to see you guys again. I'm in good company, and I enjoy these chats.
John. Yeah. Excuse me.
Scott.
I'm sorry, I'm jumping in already. Can you give me the opportunity, perhaps, because I wanted to do this, just to try and steelman John's argument first, or John's pushback? No? Is that reasonable?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, so first of all, John and I very much respect John. I look up to John. We share a lot of messages back and forward and stuff. So I value our coaching friendship here. I think John agrees with a lot. This is what I'm trying to steal, man. I think John agrees with a lot of the tenets of ecological dynamics. I think he believes the importance of representative learning design. I think he believes the importance of tight perception-action coupling. And I believe he thinks that it has a lot to tell us about effective learning and coaching environments. I'm not sure he believes it tells us how to be a coach necessarily. And I think perhaps he finds an issue with perhaps a sense of overzealousness by the ecological community, that people are running towards the ecological approach as that this is the final answer to skill development generally, and might be putting the cart before the horse a little bit. So that's what I'd like to start with and say. I think John and I agree on lots of things. Now, under the hood, what's going on, whether perception is wholly direct. John's down another avenue in a rabbit hole at the moment with a different kind of theoretical perspective on that. But I think largely our thoughts about, again, representative design and whatnot, and highly contextualized learning experience scaled to the learner is ultimately a good thing. I don't know if I've done a good job of steelmanning you there, John, but you can go ahead now.
You're absolutely right, Scott. There's very, very little that I have found myself disagreeing with that's come out of your stable. I wholeheartedly agree with representational design. I wholeheartedly agree with the concept of direct perception and how that influences people's interaction with their environment. And from our perspective, we're talking about whether you want to call them students or athletes or participants, but they're interacting in our environment as we attempt to assist them or facilitate them with their skill development. I guess where we would maybe have a differing viewpoint would be right at the heart of the theoretical discussions around direct perception or the role of perception. And I'm not sure, and I guess this is one of my pet hates around a lot of these papers that come out in relation to skill acquisition. I don't think we're talking to the coaches. I don't think we're using the language of coaching enough in relation to these debates. But one of my pet peeves, I guess, in relation to ecological dynamics is that it's one theory of direct perception. And I know it was originally conceptualized by Gibson in the 60s and into the 70s. The role of direct perception doesn't only exist within ecological dynamics. So if we're looking at that spectrum of cognitive sciences, or that spectrum of cognition, which on one end is the dualistic Cartesian kind of perspective of the mind and body are being two separate things. That dates back a number of centuries, and within the middle of the 20th century, we had this cognitive revolution where the behaviorist theories that were based on that kind of dualistic approach were challenged. And we've moved along that spectrum, or that continuum, and we've moved into embodied and inactive kind of an inactive space along that spectrum. And that's where I'm sitting at the moment with active inference. So the active inference framework essentially says that the brain operates as a statistical model. So it's operating as a predictive machine, which kind of mediates perception. But it suggests that perception and action are tightly coupled. The further down that spectrum you go into what would be termed radical inactivism is where ecological psychology sits. And ecological psychology has greatly influenced ecological dynamics, and the dynamics part of that in terms of movement comes from the complexity sciences and dynamical systems theory, which is absolutely fine. So I guess to get into where my pet peeves are, and I'll go back to what I said there a second ago in relation to papers such as, and let me start by saying I wouldn't diss any attempt to publish a paper. I know how much work goes into these things, and I know people want to add value to the discourse and value to research. So I wouldn't just diss the paper and say it's full of crap or nonsense or anything like that. I did have issues with certain parts of it. And most of it is around, and it's not just this paper, but in ecological dynamics itself, is that there's an attempt to kind of relabel or nearly reinvent the wheel, or add new labels to coaching methods that have been in existence for a long, long time. And what I'm referring to there is the concept of problem-based learning, situated learning, learning in the game-based learning. You could even throw teaching games for understanding in there, although it's a little bit further out on that spectrum. And coaches have been doing these things for a very, very long time. For example, game-based learning and conditioned games, which is something that was something that is used and has been around for a long time before constraints-led coaching came around, which is very, very similar in its practical approach, in that coaches will manipulate tasks to seek a desired outcome. Now, there's some theoretical differences in terms of the constraint-led approach is very much about movement and skill emerging organically from the application of certain constraints or natural constraints or constraints that have been imposed by the coach, for example. So these coaching methods and these approaches to skill development have been around for a long time, and coaches have been doing them for a long time. Where ecological dynamics differs is at a theoretical level in relation to internal representation and how we view the world and how we interact with the world. And a lot of the differences are extremely philosophical. And sometimes I wonder whether that debate is even worth having with coaches who are looking for ways, practical ways or practical methods to bring to their coaching practice. Now, to go back to James' original point about the reel, which was triggering, right? Because it triggered me to a response, and here we are today.
Perfect.
This whole idea, so it was a little bit absolutist. It was a little bit out there, James, in relation to what you said about drills and pad work. And I get that, right? They're a part of the mechanism in skill development, and some people will probably put too much emphasis on them. And some coaches will know exactly where they fit within the context. I have a big bugbear with the use or the term drills, being told about drills being ineffective, etc. Now, it took me a little while to get my head around the understanding of this, because it appears to me now that actually we all carry different definitions of what drills actually are. And we had this discussion, myself and Scott, online. I sent him a little clip of a couple of juniors I was coaching on the national team a couple of years back. and it was we were working through getting off the ropes or getting out of the corner in a relatively dynamic fashion. There was no prescriptive kind of, okay, you must do this, you must do that. They were allowed to, let me use the term, organize themselves. They were operating under real intention, but with the contact scale back, light for learning. I like to use that concept. Some people would look at it and say, depending on the angle that you're looking at it, would say that's a conditioned game. Some may say I'm applying constraints here to allow movement to different skill behavior to emerge. Colloquially in kickboxing, in Ireland anyway, but my understanding is probably pretty consistent across the board. That's a drill. Okay, so this is colloquially termed a drill. And I guess I could say I'm fed up to the back teeth with people just throwing out this, kill the drills. Drills don't equal skills. And I understand that when it's looked at from the perspective of drilling from, for example, that military kind of tradition of following a prescriptive staged approach to developing something. And I get that totally, but not everybody shares that definition. Now, I've rambled for far too long there, so I'll shut up and allow you guys to come in. But that's generally my perspective. But I do absolutely agree with a lot of what Scott has to say, 100%.
I hope you're enjoying the chat so far. Before we get back to that, I just want to let you know that Sweet Science of Fighting is more than just a podcast. We have a full training app with strength conditioning programs for strikers, grapplers, and MMA athletes, so you don't have to think about what you're doing, and you're getting access to the latest scientific methods to improve combat sports performance. We have programs specifically for judo, for jiu-jitsu, for wrestling, MMA, boxing, Muay Thai is coming soon. All these things are going to be in the training app. We also have a private community where some of the coaches that have been on the podcast are in there to help you with any training questions and any performance questions you have. For example, Andrew Usher and Casper DeWitt. We also have some online courses within the training app. They cover strength, conditioning, mental skills, and weight cutting. And finally, we now have Ryan Villalobos in the community, a second degree jiu-jitsu black belt, who is there to break down any of your grappling matches that you want seen to by a second eye. He's currently breaking down videos on a separate Sweet Science of Fighting YouTube channel, and he will break down your video within the community. So if you have a match or a roll that you just recorded, you can upload that in there and Ryan will break that down for you. So what are you waiting for? Jump down in the description. You can check out the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground. Otherwise, enjoy the podcast. Is that just a terminology thing? And that's the main issue around. Yeah, it's just a terminology. That's what I heard you say before the podcast. I was talking to Scott and I was like, I'm pretty sure we're going to align with everything. And the only thing that's going to be the issue is probably just terminology. But Scott, was there anything you wanted to add on top of that?
No, so I agree. The use of the word drill is problematic because there's a different definition and different interpretation of it among coaches. So when John sent me that little clip, okay, that for me was a little task-based situational snippet of the game, which I would still consider sparring. So yes, it's not helpful for every coach, but the way I talk about it, and again, I can be a little bit clickbaity, thought of drilling, rote repetition, highly prescribed, just rote repetition. Now, the fact that we use the word militaristic, I think perhaps, and I'm not sure, I don't know the full etymology of the term coming into sports, but I think that does have connotations. And I think the word drill does have connotations of this rote repetition. So I get why coaches have different interpretations of it and different and they define it differently. But if we are talking about that in the sense of that rote repetition, then I don't think the title is quite as clickbaity or triggering as it perhaps was, or I don't think it should be, because I do think there's a lot of that goes on. Now, to your point, John, that all great coaches have already done this, I also agree. What this paper, I feel, a little biased, a very modest contribution, and what the approach is doing, there's two things that I think are wonderful here. It's drawing a lot of coaches into a space that would never have been into that theoretical space. And I think that should be celebrated. Even if they're fucking up the science right now, they don't quite have a grasp of it. The fact that you've got coaches and athletes and students in martial arts starting to pay attention, through the sharing of social media, whatever, starting to be curious. We talk about that all the time, John, being curious. I think that should be celebrated. Now, they might not come down on the side of ecological dynamics, and maybe that's where this tug of war is going to be in the future, which side of the pulling into. But I think it's wonderful that, because when I was coaching, and even when I was reading about coaching and trying to get into it and being curious, these discussions weren't going on. And they're getting much richer and better now. So I think we can all agree that's a good thing, right? To your point about coaches have already done this, or Thornton was talking about aliveness for 25 years, correct. Now, I think the aliveness can precede that, the talk of aliveness, through Bruce Lee and whatnot. But I'll grant that. In fact, one of my when I had Adam Singer on, I paid the respect due to Coach Matt when I said standing on the shoulders of the aliveness giant. That was the name of the title. So I personally recognize that we are somewhat coming behind all these great coaches. But what's happened so far, I think, John, is that a lot of coaches are having this mix and match thing. And my question would be to a lot of coaches, okay, what if you're doing what you're doing, if you're designing a practice activity, what do you actually think is going on? I think having a theoretical perspective will help at least answer that question, and will narrow the search space for coaches. And at least if they're throwing shite at the wall, that shite will be a little bit stickier, you know? I hope I didn't get too technical for you there at the end. The last thing I want to add on to John is we're all guilty of this. So we're all, and that's why I wanted to start off as a steel man. We're all guilty of being a straw man on the other side, and we're very, very guilty of a lot of the coaches are saying this is IP, this is ecological, without a full understanding of what IP is. Also, IP didn't disregard the high importance of putting context into the training environment. It had a different assumption of what was going on, and it was more of a linear process, how we built things and put it together. But it was still a very, very important part of the informational process and approach, with whether it be the generalized motor program, which we then in context. So they overlap a bit more than we give them credit for. So I agree, when we're arguing back and forward, but both sides have the tendency to do that.
Yeah,
there's my ramble.
It's a great point. Can't disagree with any of that, Scott, to be honest with you. And I was thinking about this before we came on, and I thought, if we got all of the coaches that are on both sides and in the middle of all of this debate, and you asked them to put their hand up about who actually is here to help people get better at their sport, everybody put your hand up. We'd all put our hand up. Every one of us would put our hand up. We all share that commonality. Which is why we're here, I think, discussing this the way we are. I agree to a point around the ecological dynamics, the theory-based papers coming out that allows coaches to kind of get a grasp of what's going on and bring them into that picture of discussion. And you mentioned about being constantly curious, and it might help in that way. I have personally, I can only speak about this personally, I've got a different perspective on that, because when I ventured into the ecological dynamics world, I found curiosity was something that wasn't entertained. Now, I'll caveat that particular thing I've said by saying that was based a lot on interactions through Twitter, as it was at the time, which is probably not the best space to be interacting with like-minded people. But I did find my curiosity was stifled, especially in around the use of drills, also the use of instruction, which is another pet peeve of mine. And again, I think it's pushed by coaches who don't fully understand the theory that underpins ecological dynamics. And it's not too long ago, you can go back on X as it is now and look at conversations I had with people who would shove ecological dynamics down your throat as if it was the be-all and end-all and the solution to world poverty and ending wars. Didn't fully understand the role of instruction within an ecological dynamics framework, and said it shouldn't be used. In fact, one person said there should be, one coach, if I could call him that, said that there should be a move towards non-verbal coaching. And I mean, this kind of nonsense. And then as we dug into the theory a little bit more, their position changed from, well, sometimes instructions are needed because as long as it's not too many instructions, because instructions kill creativity. And then it went from that into instructions are fine, actually, because we can just say they're constraints, so everything is cool in relation to instructions. That confuses the life out of coaches who are coming to ecological dynamics or the idea of direct perception. It confuses the life out of them. I've had conversations with people who they've recoiled from it because of how this misinterpretation of the theory is put forward by those who claim to know it best. And when I say that, I'm talking about coaches and not people who would be actual experts in the area of the theory itself. That's the part I think that we're not doing the coaches any. I don't think we're doing them any service at all in relation to and I include myself in this, and how we're actually going about that debate. So if there's lots of different definitions around the use of drills, for example, why not just call it out as rote learning? We all get rote learning doesn't work from a skill acquisition perspective. Why don't we just focus in on block practice as opposed to just using the term drill, which might mean something for me, something for Scott, something for James, completely different. I think from a theoretical perspective, I think it's useful for coaches to understand how human beings interact with their environment and how they move within their environment. I think that has to underpin everything that we do. The option to go down that rabbit hole should be left open for coaches. Some may have absolutely no interest in going down that avenue. It's an area where only a few of us kind of reside because I guess we're curious about getting stuck into the meat about why we're doing certain things. Some coaches are really just interested in methods that are going to help them become better coaches and methods that are going to help their participants become better or more skillful movers. I think that for me is probably one of the biggest downfalls in some of these theoretical conversations. But when you dig right into it, when you move all the coaching methods and all the practice stuff away and the learning design away from it, where the discrepancy actually sits between some of these internal representation or not, internal models or not. And for me, I don't think 90% of the coaches really care about that as one. And number two, I wonder whether the conversations around those theoretical constructs are actually useful in the broader world of coaching.
Would you, if I'm trying to bring this practical, would you say that regardless of all these models, the end goal is pretty much the same? You're trying to train a fighter that can essentially problem solve what is happening in front of them and use basically a toolbox that they've developed through coaching to solve that problem. Would that just be the end goal regardless of how someone's trying to approach it then?
Yeah, I think so. I think the really interesting debate, I think, for coaches is around what might be defined as just bad coaching versus better coaching. I mean, if you go to any combat sport event or tournament or competition, and you've got coaches sitting in the corner, you will see 9 times out of 10 you'll see them joysticking the life out of the athlete, so telling them what to do from one second to the next. And when you start to understand theory and understand how people learn and interact with their environment, and from a sport perspective, that's not only a waste of time, but you're actually probably getting in their way. Getting in the athlete's way in terms of making their own decision, self-regulating, self-organizing within the within the context in the ring or the cage, etc. So I don't want to paint a picture either that everything's rosy in the garden with combat sport coaching. It really, really isn't. And again, I just wonder whether these kind of highbrow theoretical conversations are actually hitting the audience, and targeting the audience, and that audience being other coaches. Does that make sense, Scott? What do you think?
It makes sense, and I agree, right? There can be and I always try and avoid this, and this is something me and you talk about privately, right? If we're to take it at face value, trying to if you're going down the theoretical space, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and integrate or jump between both sides of the direct perception or indirect perception space, right?
I agree.
I think it's good to be. I use the word agnostic, and it's maybe not the correct word to use here. What I'm saying is, I'm very conscious of being overzealous and saying perception's absolutely direct. But for me, I've had to pick a side, right? Or I've picked a side. I've chosen to pick a side which resonates with myself. What I like about the ecological approach is that for me it's quite simple and elegant. It's a lot of work to get my head around, but it helps me parse out what I actually believe is going on when a human being learns to interact with their environment and learn. And I think it can give me a lot of information, and it can help, I think, me design effective practices. It doesn't really tell me how to coach, how to interact with a human being, how to get my player and my team lifted up, how to create that bond, that unity of everyone, how to communicate. It doesn't really tell us any of that. But I'd like to circle back to maybe something you mentioned in the Instagram too, that we've created some kind of straw man by saying that there's this kind of this kata, or perhaps in the paper that this is what goes on in gyms, and you push back, and fairly you push back, say, well, that's not, we're characterizing this as being a part of combat sports, but in your experience you don't really see much of that. I think a quick scroll through social media, or certainly gyms that I've been in and whatnot, there's a ton of that going on. There's a ton of this rote repetition and rote drills, and to be quite frank, fucking nonsense going on in gyms.
Those are Scott's favorite Instagram posts to comment on and then to get blocked.
That could easily be eliminated by just coaches having even a superficial understanding of what skill is. Whether it be from even an information processing account, which again doesn't say we have to strip all the context away, and it eventually puts that back in. All coaches have always used constraints. All coaches have always trusted or relied on self-organization in a sense, because it's impossible to micromanage to that scale your athletes. So we've all trusted that, whether we know about it or not. So yes, effective coaching practices have come, emerged, and just organically evolved over time, because that's who's created the best fighters. But we're still stuck in this. I would argue most gyms are still having this mismatch of things that make a lot of sense and are wholly aligned with how we see the sport, John, and being representative and contextually rich. But there's still a lot of this shite left in there. And I think having an approach and an understanding of theory helps you just to minimize some of that shite.
Hey guys, it's me again. I just want to let you know that I also have Sweet Science of Fighting rash guards and shorts, so you can represent Sweet Science of Fighting on the mats and within competition. We have the classic, just like the shirt I'm wearing, rash guard, Sweet Science of Fighting on the front, and we have the logos on the sleeves, and then X Martial on the back. We also have that in a shorts variation, same thing, with the Sweet Science of Fighting writing on one leg, and we have the logo on the other. But my personal favorite, this is my personal favorite by far. We have this in black and white, and it is the Taniwha Protector Guardian version of the Sweet Science of Fighting, with the logo on the back. This was designed by a Māori designer back in New Zealand, so a bit of my heritage on this jersey. It represents the acknowledgement of battle and war. It also represents strength and stability, and also has the New Zealand silver fin. But even if you're not a Kiwi, cop this. This is an awesome design. It is a custom-made design. You will not find it anywhere else. So check that. That'll also be down in the description with a discount code. But back to the podcast.
Again, I don't want to get too technical here.
Well, you're in good company. No, and I agree. I absolutely agree. But sometimes I wonder whether, as you say, you're scrolling through social media. Now, there's a lot of fucking shite on social media. My God, in terms of what's happening in combat sports.
Can I just add there, John? Sorry, John. Can I just add? You see a lot of shite in some of the highest level gyms with the highest level performers.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And some of the worst.
James's whole channel's about that in many ways. That's where it gets all clickbait.
I've been breaking all sorts of strength and conditioning stuff just from clips, and people seem to enjoy it. But yeah, I mean, it's very few and far between you find something that's somewhat sound.
Absolutely, you know, and some of the dumbest stuff you see in the most highly paid gyms, you know, the professional ranks, where they've got the money to bring in experts, but they don't. You know, they bring in their mate from the block who's been holding pads all his life and what have you, and you do see all sorts of mad stuff coming out in terms of tennis balls getting thrown at people and laser beams and touching flashing lights, and that's all in the that's all in the race to look super tech and super flashy and novel. And and Scott's point is good. When you start to understand the theory that underpins how human beings move, become skillful, then we know that this stuff is absolute pants, you know. But to go back to the rote repetition stuff, sometimes I think there's then the straw man that I refer to, and I'll bring information processing theory into this in a second. Sometimes the straw man I think that's is referring to is that coaches, or some coaches, will use rote repetition, chasing the ideal technique, coaching technique through verbal instruction, making sure it looks picture perfect, and then trying to insert that into a performance. So it goes straight from rote repetition into a dynamic context into the performance. There's a middle bit. Fitz and Posner refer to it as this associative stage, where you kind of build up on the understanding of that, agree with that if you will or not. But I think most coaches will rightly or wrongly go through a process of trying to piece it together before it goes into the performance environment. Now, for me, I think that's where the beauty of good coaching actually sits, is making sure that it's being pieced together in a way that it can be transferred to the performance environment. There's lots of ways that coaches might think they're piecing it together that actually won't transfer to the performance environment. And sometimes information processing theory gets it gets the shit beaten out of it a lot. There's no information processing coaching manual anywhere that suggests you must do rote repetition and then get in and play the game. It doesn't say that at all, and I think that's it's a bit of a information processing theory is a little bit of a bogeyman under the bed.
Do you want to just define that quickly, John? Just
information process, yeah, sure. So information processing theory is a theory on how we understand the brain as from a computational perspective. So it essentially suggests that the brain is a passive receiver of information. Mm-hmm. So information goes in, the brain will computate and cognate and run through a series of stages before it makes a decision, and that decision then is the output of the action. Mm-hmm. So we've got input, cognition, and then output from an information processing. And it was pretty much built on our understanding of how computers work, right? Now, things have moved on drastically in cognitive science, and I don't think there's anyone now that's active within the field would suggest that the brain works like a computer. And that's where direct perception comes in. So the idea that's posited by ecological dynamics and embodied cognition would suggest that perception and action are nearly one of the same thing. They're tightly coupled. So there's no processing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because that's the part in the paper that you had an issue with, where it was whatever the information was, then it was cognition, and then it was action, perception, cognition, and action. I think it was.
Yeah, exactly.
In the paper, and that's
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And Scott, in fairness, did clarify that for me by suggesting another paper which I read, which is really enjoyable. But I don't think information processing is the problem. Now, I'll caveat that by saying a lot of the coach education syllabi that has come throughout the years has been influenced by how formal education is actually carried out. So when you go to school, for example, how do you learn your times tables? By fucking doing them over and over again, right? Rote repetition. That's how you learn them. It's how you retrieve them, to use that terminology. A lot of those methods creeped into coach education and into skill acquisition. And I guess if you just unravel that enough, somewhere along the way, you'll find methods that will be underpinned by what might be termed as information processing theory. And that's where the jumble up in coach ed and, coaching methods, I think, actually happens. But I've lost my train of thought there slightly. I was going back to the information processing theory as a straw man. I think we're wasting our time keep pointing at this information processing thing. Nobody anywhere really understands, or no one anywhere knows that their coaching practice is being underpinned by information processing theory. Like, you won't go to a gym anywhere in the world and see IP over the door. This is an information processing gym, but you will see ecological over some gyms and some labels and stuff, and that's fine. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I just think there's a strawman argument in relation to like ecological dynamics and ecological psychology sits on the far end of that spectrum I spoke about earlier, radical and activism. Information processing theory sits on the very opposite end of it. In the middle is a whole spectrum of cognition and our understanding of the brain and our interaction with the environment. And just a little bit back from information or from ecological psychology, is embodied or situated cognition, which does actually suggest that perception and action are coupled. The only difference here and here is that right here, it suggests that we're still using a model, an internal model. Ecological psychology would say no model. And for me, sometimes I think, who gives a fuck? If we understand that that perception is direct, and that environmental and contextual information is key, and we share that understanding here, that for me is the magic that influences the methods behind coaching. Does that make sense, even?
It makes sense. Here's John. While I'll push back and say I don't think it's a straw man. I can see from your perspective that you believe it's a straw man, and I agree. I've yet to meet the coach who says we are an IP gym and we have IP above the door. I have ecological above our door. I mean, figuratively speaking. But this seems to be the de facto position that most coaches, without any kind of theoretical understanding, because it's IP or the computational, idea of the brain being a computer, input, process, output, has been the really main game in town for the last couple of generations. So I think most coaches actually believe that. They might not have a sophisticated understanding of what's going on, and admittedly they might not, but I think the majority of coaches out there still have this idea, or if you were to press them or ask them what's going on, they would probably have this thing. This is why we the terms muscle memory comes out, This is why, we're going to get it down. If they do that, you'll do this. This is, John, you're clearly in upper levels of coaching, so you're not seeing as much as this. But I would say this is the majority of what goes on in gyms all over the world. And I think what this paper has done, and what this paper intended to do, was give a different perspective and help, the way it was written too, with the case studies and whatnot, was to help coaches, start a discussion. And I'm celebrating that wholly, that it's certainly taken off in grappling, and there's this big debate in the grappling space now. And unfortunately, the debate, because it's early and immature, and the coaches haven't quite got their heads around it yet, we're still talking about, we'll do 20% of our class is IP, and then the rest ecological. So they have a sense that ecological means just doing the fucking thing, right? And they have a sense that the IP is, let's break it all down and micromanage it. To an extent, that's a really, really rough kind of, 30,000 foot view. But when the only game in town has been this wax on, wax off, paint the fence, Mr. Miyagi shit for the last couple of generations, I think, let me use this word without sounding offensive. I think naively, just because you're at the higher levels of coaching, John, you don't see that this is part and parcel of most training environments across, not just across martial arts, but across sports generally.
It's a fair point, but I also came through that process myself, so I wasn't born into the world that, coaching with a national team, and I started off coaching children, and in a very prescriptive fashion, actually, coming from traditional martial arts of Taekwondo. And I went on my own journey then. I came across problem-based learning and situated learning, etc., which pushed me into trying to understand constraints-based coaching and stuff like that. But again, Scott, I just wonder whether the for the want of a better terminology, the theoretical kind of Mickey measuring that goes on through academic papers and stuff like that, whether it's actually beneficial to coach, to bring in coaches along on a journey. I think all coaches need to know is how and why people perceive information in their environment and how they act on that. And you can bring that in through different coaching methods and styles of practice. And you're right when you say what you said in relation to you'll do eco D for a bit and do IP for a little bit. And I was listening to one of the actual experts in ecological dynamics. Keith Richards was on a podcast not so long ago, and he even made reference to
Keith
Davids. Yeah. Who did I say?
Richards.
No, he's the guitar player. Yeah. No, sorry.
See,
Apologies to Keith
you must have
David.
perceived
Keith David.
the guitar on the wall there.
Because the
Yep.
guitar's in the
Yes, yes,
background.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
And you
yeah. Keith Richards,
resonated with
my brother.
the
If
Stones.
Keith
man.
David is listening in, I do apologise. But you are still one of the experts in ecological dynamics, and it was a really interesting podcast. And he referenced a learning as being on a continuum, you know, and he said that, you know, down one end of that continuum, it's stable. We might need to use verbal instruction or verbal commands. It might need to be simple in terms of the information that's available to the learner. But the further you go up that continuum, it becomes unstable, you know, into that kind of practice fidelity, you know, where you've got that lots of contextual information at play. So even within ecological dynamics, there's an understanding that we need to shift along this continuum of learning, depending on the context, but it's knowing that we shouldn't stay at any one point for too long. So I think maybe some of the issues in combat sport coaching is that a lot of the time is spent maybe down within that stable, kind of low contextual interference kind of part of the continuum, possibly.
So again, and with regard to this paper and the approach, if coaches take ecology serious, so what I try to tell myself now and my coaches, okay, I'm going to take. I could be wrong, could absolutely be wrong, but if I'm going to be coaching from this perspective, I'm going to take direct perception seriously. I'm going to take ecology seriously. I'm going to take self-organization seriously, and that covers an umbrella of different terms and different concepts. So when we talk about the starting position, and that was my contribution to the paper, was getting onboarding learners, right? If, again, from our perspective, there is a world out there, and we are immersed in this lawfully structured information. Right from the get-go, I want them to start in a manageable, safe way to start tuning and picking up on that information. Because I believe that's what the approach is telling us, and the theory is telling us, that this is what underpins skilled action over time. So, and to go back to Coach Thornton, the 3I method, they had the introduction stage, which in many ways sounds super reasonable, right? We're going to kind of do the things, and maybe even I don't want to because Adam will chastise me if I get this wrong, but there's maybe a space for this rote repetition to start with, to get in a more technical ideal down first, and then we're going to integrate it. I think from my perspective, and again, taking direct perception, self-organization, and ecology seriously, and I know Adam's moving that way too, we're going to either try and remove that altogether, this introduction part, or we are going to squeeze it into a very, very small space. I don't think it's particularly coherent to say we're going to show you what to do and tell you what to do and how to move, but then we really don't, as ecological coaches, we really don't believe in that. But this is maybe going to be, one step back to take two steps forward. Perhaps it is. Perhaps there is a better way to get someone at least moving close to that ideal first. I don't believe it, but I'm not overzealous. I'm saying that this is ultimately detrimental in the long term, because I think you're going to get there. And the spectrum you spoke about, this is what we're trying to do as a community. We're trying to shove people along that spectrum. And if we leave all this wiggle room, John, that well, it doesn't completely violate the ecological approach by giving some direct instruction and whatnot. I think what we're doing is we're allowing to continue this mismatch of ideas. And perhaps there's a role to be a little bit overzealous just now and overshoot a little bit now, to drag the coaches who want to come, to drag them into this space, deep into this space. And then they can start walking it back a little bit and picking things from a practical standpoint. From a practical standpoint, when they're dealing with their students, I don't talk to my students with all the... I struggle to talk to you about it with the highfalutin language, but I certainly don't do that with my students. I got to meet them where they are at. And when they're coming in on the first day, I got to meet them where they're at. But sometimes meeting them where they're at is trying to undo years and years of seeing all this shite on social media and this perception of what it is to learn martial arts. We're going to tell you exactly how to stand. You're going to move your feet only this way, and this kind of stuff. And I don't think it's helpful. So I'd rather get rid of it altogether and that's what we try and do. And I think this is what the paper was. Of course, I'm biased. I think this is what the paper was trying to present.
Yeah, I'm finding it really hard to disagree with you. Sorry, James. No, you're 100% right, and I think it boils down to the context, you know. So let's take rote repetition away for a second, and let's bring in, say, isolated practice just for a moment.
John, I'm sorry, I'm very rude of me to interrupt. I'd love to take it away, but what I'm saying is, I think this is ubiquitous amongst gyms across all learning environments. That there's still a ton of this roteness going on. Maybe not in yours, and I know why it's not in yours, because you're an informed coach and you coach at the higher levels, and you don't see much value at all in that. But what we're trying to do here as maybe communicators who are, especially me, right? You're in the academic space and the coaching space. I'm not really in the academic space, right? I'm not even consider myself practical. I'm academically curious, and I'm in these. I've managed to fucking find a seat at the table somehow, sneak my way in, and I'm talking to coaches in that space. But really, what I'm trying to do is make the best learning environment for my people in my gym, who don't give a fuck about the science. They just want a good experience. And for some of them, they really want to learn to be skillful. And so I think there's a danger with what you're saying is you seem to be, again, my perception that this rote repetition is such a small part of the game. We don't really need to worry about it so much. I think it's a bigger part of the broader community than perhaps you think it is.
Do you think sometimes we get confused with isolated practice and rote learning?
Yes. Well, you would have to define what you think isolated practice is for me, I think, because I'd certainly isolate parts of the practice. Absolutely, I do. Yeah. But I'm always keeping this, and this is what we talk about, the fighter cage system. Now, we had a discussion about that, and again, I only had a small contribution. What the words we were going to use, okay? And was it fighter system? Was it the different the terminology that we're going to use? Now, I have my own ways of speaking about things, and they're all just words and labels. It's the meaning that's important. So one of the themes that continues to come through, and from that paper too, was the relationship the fighter has with their environment, with their opponent, with their cage, with their skill development generally, with their intentionality. And I think that is a great message, regardless of what we think is going on in the theoretical approach. If coaches can get that down and just know how important it is that when two fighters or training partners come together, that itself is a complex adaptive system from which behaviors are going to emerge. I think coaching can take a giant leap up just from that understanding alone. And I think we're both on the same page here.
Yeah, we are 100%. We absolutely are on the same page. But what I found in the paper was that there was an attempt to relabel certain things that didn't need to be relabeled based on theoretical constructs, such as fight IQ, for example. Mm-hmm. Is that an argument we really need to be having?
Yeah, but possibly we don't need to be having, but they have to choose words, right? And it is a white paper.
Just to be a little bit picky about some aspects of the paper. And what I said at the start was some of the relabeling or reinventing the wheel. There was a paragraph on why using terms like fight IQ might be counterproductive and reductionist. And is that really, is that where we're going with this debate in terms of relabeling things? There was also reference to, maybe in your experience, but never in mine, kata being used as part of a performance preparation. So my interpretation of kata is the old traditional making forms with your hands and punching in very traditional ways, the air essentially, and not at people.
I don't think it's a big
coach
leap.
worth their salt would be using kata.
I agree. No, MMA coaches worth their salt, but I think if you just swap the word kata out, I get why you think that was maybe a stretch.
That's a straw man for sure. Yeah.
Well, I would say it could be considered a straw man, but if you were just to swap out, and this is what I messaged you, if you were just to swap out the kata with combo of the day, I don't think it then is quite the straw
Yeah,
man.
but you
that
see, you're
think.
talking to martial artists, and I think if you ask any martial artist what a kata is, you'll get that traditional definition
Sure.
of kata.
Sure.
You
And a
know,
kata, I
so
remember from karate when I was younger, it was a
yeah,
30,
exactly. Everyone
40.
marching up and down in
Yes.
lines in white pajamas. Yeah,
Yeah. I still don't.
yeah, which doesn't happen in MMA gyms. In fairness, so I thought I was a little maybe disingenuous towards MMA coaches, regardless of where they are on their journey. Kata is not. It's not a thing in sport-based gyms anyway.
Okay, but if kata is a prescriptive rehearsal of some idealized sequence, I don't think it's a big leap to say katas are any different from these combinations that you see practiced day in, day out all over our social media. So when
No,
we see it on
absolutely,
social
yeah.
media, this is happening. We're seeing it at the highest levels. We're seeing professional fighters do these.
Yes.
You call it kata, you can call it a combo of the day, you can call it whatever. This rehearsal of an idealized technique. And it gets worse than that, John. There's coaches out there with enormous followings, right? That triggers us all, that are talking about the nuances of where the foot placement is and where you're driving off on it. I will grant you all day that there's better and worse ways to produce force from kicks and punches. But again, I take self-organization seriously, and I don't think it's helpful. And this is, again, for me, what the paper is trying to push back against. So I accept that you didn't like the use of the word kata, and you thought that was maybe a low blow. But I don't think when you, again, I think they're almost synonymous, kata and the let's do the six strike combo on a pad over and over and over and over. That's rote, and I don't think rote and kata are. I think they're bedfellows.
No, but I'm not to go on about it, but I think kata is understood within the martial arts world as something very specific, which is that white pajamas, marching in lines, punching up and down the hall under the command of a senior instructor, counting from 1 to 10. What you're essentially referring to there is that kind of decontextual kind of movement, or even the use of, overly constraining a student. And you're talking about footwork, and you see this all the time on social media. People being told exactly where to put their feet, and they're being constrained by, markings on the floor or plates on the floor that they've put their feet on and things like that. I mean, for me, that shows a fundamental ignorance around just how people move. They don't need to be told where to put their feet. If they don't know where to put their feet, they'll fucking fall down, They'll find that out pretty quickly when you get them moving a little bit against each other. And there's lots of games, and some of them are mentioned in the paper about how to bring that kind of movement out and what have you. So yeah, I think we're 100% on the same page when we dig into the nuances of it. And I know papers, in particular, scholarly papers and articles for science journals and what have to have a specific kind of structure and formality and language to them. But I would suggest that coaches are probably getting more out of this conversation, which has been influenced by the paper. There's no doubt about it. And myself, Scott, and you, James, have had conversations around our observations and understanding of what happens on social media. I'll go back to my original point, is that I don't know if harping on about information processing and other theoretical constructs is doing the conversation any use.
And that's where, again, we respectfully disagree, because I think it's creating a conversation at least.
Yeah, but we could have that conversation without. I mean, you could take ecological dynamics out of that paper completely, not mention it, and still be a good paper around here's better ways to coach based on certain understandings of perception and action.
We could, but it was specifically addressing this approach and introducing this approach to coaches. It was the first, and we spoke about it too. I spoke about the authors the other day that when people are asking for definitive studies and metrics and on an ecological approach and ecological learning, that's not that easy to get into a science paper. It's not that easy to do a study of fighters in their actual environment. One of the things too, again, I take seriously, is that this idea of perturbations, all right, or noise, or having to, when someone's kicking and punching you and moving with you, this is the sport. And when we strip that away from the training environment, I believe we're doing our athletes an enormous disservice. It's wholly
100%.
artificial and false.
But information processing theory, if you wanted to dig into that, doesn't argue against that.
I agree. That's
It's
what we started out with.
very
I
strong.
think there's an overlap.
There is an overlap, and I think that overlap is sometimes missed in those theoretical conversations, because the bogeyman is always information processing theory, and we get into rabbit holes around how the brain works, and like, what the fuck's that? Who cares? From a coaching perspective, who cares?
I want to try to sum up kind of your guys' points. Definitely agree pretty much on most things. I'll say, John, you talked before about training like across the spectrum, right? You're training maybe, if we're just talking striking example, pad work, various live games, whatever it is, sparring, and then you're going to be more or less on either side or in the middle, depending on what stage you are, somewhat. Scott's saying just almost skip out the pad side because it's not representative of what's happening. Now, I'll jump to what you're saying, John, about perception and action always being coupled. I know you guys both say that too. So then my question would be, I think hopefully this should be good for the listeners to kind of sum everything up as well. At what point then does, we'll call it rote learning in terms of maybe combinations of pads and things like that, at what point does that become less effective for someone to learn because the perception and the environment is not the same or similar to what is happening when someone's in front of them?
I'll go first now, and I'm guilty of dismissing pad work. Right, we don't do any pad work in our group practice. I tell my boys, do pad work till the cows come home. Again, we have to. I think an important thing for coaches to do is whatever they have their athlete do, ask yourself, what is it we think's going on here? What are we trying to achieve? Pad work has tremendous benefits in certain regards. If we're talking about it from a skilled action perspective and being able to transfer skills to a fighting context, I think the value is very limited. If it's for, John and I talk about that too, if it's for power expression and whatnot, confidence, conditioning, I grant all that. Now, again, it was a conversation John and I have had. Is that power expression somewhat false too when you don't have the perturbations, when the temporal and the spatial constraints are not the same? I don't know, because I see the highest level fighters look, I mean, magically wonderful on pads, but I don't see that necessarily manifest in a fight. Likewise, I see beautiful technique, idealized technique out there. I don't necessarily see that manifest in a fight. I did share the other day, and I've spoke about this before, Donald Cerrone, and I posted it the other day, but I forget who, was it Evan Dunham? I keep getting this wrong. I'm not sure if it was Evan. He landed the 4-piece, right?
Yep.
And everyone lost their shit because a 4-piece landed. Yet routinely, they're practicing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 strike sequences with duck unders and step overs and that. You're hard pressed to find 4-pieces that land routinely. Most of fighting is chaotic. It's a little messy. That is the sport. And I think as long as we're training in that space responsibly and ethically, I think we're doing our fighters the best service we can give them.
I think there's limited application to the use of pads. To be honest with you, I'm not a fan of them. I try not to use them, but I have found them to be useful with certain athletes who actually find them enjoyable. So I won't take that away from them from the fact that they enjoy them. I won't tell them that they're wasting their time. I don't want to kill their enjoyment. I have used them to some success in what we might call priming, or increasing sensitivity to certain affordances. So if we're about to step into the ring against another fighter who we've studied and we've managed to kind of suss out their game plan, we might have one or two tactics that will just isolate on the pads. Information processing theory says you can do that. Ecological dynamics theory says you can do that, and everything in between says you can do that. It does say you do that.
It does say you do that, John, because it does say you can guide their intent. You can guide their intention.
Sure. That's exactly the point. So from an information processing theory, it might be deemed that we're storing a general motor program for retrieval later on, and from ecological dynamics perspective, we could be increasing that sensitivity to understanding the affordance that they might come across in the ring, right? So, but the method is the same. The theoretical understanding of it is different, but to go back to the point, was that I have used pad to prep somebody right before we would get in to the ring, and to some success as well. So again, it's contextual, you know. Is doing 10 rounds of pads, of 3-minute rounds on the pads, anyway an indicator of performance ability? No, 100% it's not. I know people who are really good on the pads, and for a while there, the that style of padding from Mayweather, tap 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 tap, that was everywhere, and I was like, this is, we're getting into really silliness now.
Still everywhere.
Where people, yeah, it's still everywhere. I mean, people aren't even punching properly at this point, so it's all about how much you can actually remember in a set pattern and repeat the pattern over and over. So yeah, it goes down that rabbit hole. So I think there's a place for pads, but it's probably not where everybody thinks it is.
I'll go a little further here, and with my concern about pads, and something I've noticed recently, there's a be careful what I say. There's a certain coach out there that's built a career on the rhythm step and L step and whatnot, right? Yeah. I don't see that with my fighters, because I think what pads can perhaps do, when there's this reset moment after the combination or the thing, that's where I believe that behavior, that attractor state has come from that reset position, right? Yep. I don't see it in these engaged games. The issue I have, and the reason that I still leave room for pads, and this is maybe a larger detriment, because I'm always trying to stay on we talk about light for learning, right? It was one of our podcasts, right? That if my athletes aren't able, for ethical and safety reasons, to express true force in the spar, will that manifest in a fight? And that's a problem I have, right? That's one of the central problems, other than the head contact. Again, we both agree there. And the only interesting question for me right now in striking, there's many, but the real interesting question is, how representative is representative enough, and how light, not slow, how light can we spar to have effective transfer? I don't really know the answer to that question, and I'm staying on the cautious side. But I do think the lack of corrective feedback, and I mean corrective feedback from the sense of both informationally and realistically, the corrective feedback that you can get on pads. Yes, talk about you can have great pad holders, and pad holders can really simulate the fight. I don't think even the greatest pad work can simulate a fight. I think there's better and worse pad work. But what tends to happen, pad work is this relationship that's been built up between the pad holder and the padder, and they're on that, they resonate with each other on that same wavelength, so it looks and it feels beautiful, and that's great. That gives a lot of confidence to the fighter, and people look at it and it's aesthetically pleasing and everything. But I think it's a big red herring.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point actually that you made around the rhythm step or L steps. And how that might be an attractor state based on standing in front of pads and waiting on the next command to come. It's a really great point. I never looked at it.
Same with the bag, right?
Yeah.
Step back.
Step back. Yeah. Absolutely. It's a really, really good point. I was going to say something else about pad work there, and it's gone out of my head. What was it?
We've actually got a few questions some comments on the YouTube about it. Someone saying, Alan Lewis, he's saying, pad work is vital to teach certain combinations. It's great to do the repetitions to get muscle memory down. It is also a great way to change your reaction to certain movements and shots. And then before you respond to that, just to go on from Donald Cerrone's combo that Scott mentioned, he's saying that there are countless videos of him practicing that exact combo on pads. That specific combo can be practiced safely countless times on pads. He cannot safely practice that combo on sparring partners, and certainly cannot practice it over and over again in a single session. Any comments?
I'll jump in quickly there. If you watch the combination, it's not particularly technically ideal at all. And if you were to see someone punching and kicking like Cerrone did with that 4-piece on a pad, they would get chastised by their coach for being sloppy. This is the reality of fighting. I'm going to let John answer the muscle memory thing, because unfortunately, and I don't want to be rude to the guest or the commenter, but when someone brings up the idea of muscle memory, for me, that is showing a little bit of a lack of understanding of what's going on. Now, if you're saying muscle memory is a synonym for perceptual attunement, that's fine. But I don't think most people are using it in that regard. I think that's very, very much that muscle memory whether you think it's in the muscles, whether you think it's a motor program that we're retrieving. I don't believe in that. So if I don't believe in it, then I don't agree with it.
Yeah. And a lot of the work within psychology and within neuroscience, who actually pull apart the brain and study it, will suggest that general motor program theory was probably of its time back in the 60s and 70s. So to the guy there that commented on that, so it's not actually how the brain works. Muscles don't have memory, they don't have any cells or tissue that would represent them having any form of memory or use of memory, or even the term memory has a different understanding within the construct of direct perception or perception action coupling. And that memory is actually stored at the magical interface between the person and their environment, and through their action. So maybe to go back to Scott's point about how some of this terminology is proliferated through coaching and through combat sport, maybe with the term muscle memory, you might have an understanding that we practice something to memorize it, and then during a performance we retrieve the memory and then carry it out. There's no evidence to suggest that's how these things happen at all. And Scott mentioned the term in terms of the sensitivity to affordances, and affordances would be seen as opportunities or invitations for action through direct perception construct. And that's how our understanding of decision making, and I guess that's the underpinning of this conversation here today, is how we understand decision making. And it's not from that theoretical construct of general motor programs and schema theory, where we practice things over and over and over and then retrieve them and use them when we feel necessary. Lots of really good, there's podcasts with myself, Scott, and James talking about these constructs if you want to dive into that and see where that goes for that listener. I didn't realize we were on YouTube, so hello to everyone.
Hello. And the concept of muscle memory, I'm not, I bashed it for the longest time. I'll agree that the system has, whether you call it hysteresis or there is and it can build up, effective synergies and attractors and whatnot, and behaviors. I'll grant that. And you could almost sneak that into a form of muscle memory if you just want to use a colloquial term. But I think the way it's getting used and thrown around, I'll grant you that he maybe even practiced that on pads till the cows came home. But for every combination that someone's practiced on pads that manifests and shows up in a fight, I can show you hundreds that did not. And implore coaches to look, instead of looking at what's showing up technically and ideal in a fight, look at all the rest of the stuff. Slow fighting down a bit. Actually look at the footwork. Actually look at the technique. Actually look at the rotation and the mechanics. It's not that pretty. And then when you bring it all the way down to the lower professional levels and the amateur levels, it's even uglier. This is the reality of our sport.
Yeah.
Nice.
Which means that training for that perfect or that ideal technique or position is probably a waste of time.
I think it's futile, largely futile. Yep. But then we're all human, and we see it crop up now and again. The classic one was Connor practicing that just before he knocked out Aldo. That was they were definitely guiding his attention. His intention and attention were focused on that the chances of that happening. So it was, whatever you want to call it, it looked extraordinary, right? He managed to pull it off. He almost got clobbered and knocked out himself. It was almost a double knockdown. But even that in itself, beautifully skillful, beautifully timed. Not that technical, the way he did it, the way he come back. I'm sure he was throwing it on pads a lot more technically and powerfully. But this was the nature of the game. And if we can get we've agreed on a lot of things today, and I knew we would, John. If we can agree that whatever you want to call them, opportunities, affordances, openings, if we can agree that is the meat and potato of what makes a skilled fighter, and we need to give our fighters the opportunity in a safe manner, in an appropriately challenging manner, and in a skilled manner to, over time, detect and exploit these openings, affordances, and opportunities, I think we're doing our fighters the best service we can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
If I could just come in very quickly, James,
you go, John.
on that. Scott uses the example of McGregor practicing that check left hook when Aldo runs at him, and it's a great example, and there's a broader picture to that in terms of the whole build up to the fight was about goading Aldo enough to have him run at him and then try and catch him with that left hook, and a different perspective in terms of predictive processing. So where I'm sitting in relation to embodied cognition, we're going there. That theoretical construct would say that was a prediction that Connor was working on. So from a predictive processing perspective, but when you wipe that away and you look at the underpinning theoretical construct of that, there's a lot of overlap in terms of direct perception, affordances, opportunities for action, etc.
And this can't be glossed over, the fact that the importance of research and picking up tendencies from your potential opponent. So this is where film studying that can be useful. To think a fight's going to go exactly the way you think it's going to go. Again, you can show me the odd one, and I'll show you thousands that didn't go that way. Look at Masvidal Askren, right? Masvidal wasn't practicing his check hook in the locker room. He was practicing kneeing this motherfucker as a shot because that was more likely to happen. So again, regardless of the theoretical underpinnings, the ecological approach would just say you are helping guide intention and focusing their attention towards certain likely events. And it's okay to say likely, because Gordon Aldo to come in, a little shorter guy, and throw a haymaker was more likely than him shooting like Askren was going to shoot on Masvidal. And I like all these fighters, so I'm not shitting on either of them. I have the highest respect for all these guys.
I want to finish this podcast with one more question. It was actually asked earlier in the podcast. I never got around to asking it because I was just trying to fit it in. But from TP, I don't know if you guys have come across this. This might be interesting. He's asking, how would you explain the situation? For example, in judo, he can apply techniques very well in sparring sessions, but while drilling in place, it feels unusual to him. Any input on something like that?
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, go for it, Scott. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
No, I'd like to. So this is a conversation that's coming up a lot in the grappling space, right? Can we drill it, right? Can we drill it to get this movement down? Some will call it mental model, whatever. Can we drill it, this rehearsal? And okay, here's what I'd say about that: is practicing a move under the lowest of resistance, almost like passively, right? I don't put a lot of value in it, but what it can do, and I'm trying to squeak in some value here. It can help guide intention, right? It can help guide intention to what you're going to actually be trying to do. The problem when it's passive is you're not getting, again, if we take information detection and direct perception seriously, which I do, all the resistance and the movements and the haptic information that you're picking up on, that your body is trying to become sensitive to, that's not present. That's not present when we do it passively. So when we go to do it in a live situation, it's going to feel different. It's going to feel different because it's two different things. And I think we can't disregard that. And that is the reason I try and, again, I'm always trying to play devil's advocate because I'm Mr. fucking Switzerland over here. But I do think there's pros and cons from doing a little bit of drilling and rehearsal. Another thing it does is it makes the athlete somewhat myopic. So they have this end goal and they're not seeing the forest for the trees kind of thing. Yeah. And so again, unapologetically, we don't do any static drilling. We don't do very detailed demonstrations or whatnot. I keep the information and the demonstrations very, very sparse, kind of sloppy. I try not to show someone how I want them to move. It's all appropriately challenging end goal and task outcomes. And again, I take self-organization seriously. I think that will develop over time. But I don't want to rob the learner of the necessary information they need to be attuned to, perceptually attuned to.
I couldn't add anything more of any value to what Scott's just said there. I absolutely agree. And maybe just use a very glib analogy. It's a little bit like learning to swim without getting into the water. It's going to feel different when you get in, for sure.
Nice. Perfect. And Sean Miska just popped in saying thanks to both Scott and John for authentically sharing thoughts and ideas from their respective perspectives. And thanks for bringing the platform for a discussion such as this. Yeah, no, this has been a great chat. Sean. Thanks for tuning in, Sean, to everything as well. So we'll end this one there.
One thing, Sean. Here's yeah. You know, your our mutual friend Jamie Taylor got in touch with me today, John. Perhaps that's
Okay.
we could do a doubles match, a tag team match. Maybe myself and Sean. If you guys are up for it, we can have a chat
Yeah.
sometimes. Yourself and Jamie.
Absolutely. Yeah, sounds great. Sounds great. I think to be honest with you, the meat and all these, the magic in all these conversations is really good for coaches from a practical perspective. You know, you can read articles and papers until the cows come home, but actually getting into conversations with other coaches and teasing out different ideas, I think is where the magic lies. So absolutely, Scott. Yeah. Sounds
Love
good.
it. Yeah, do you start with you, John? Do you want to maybe share where people can find and follow you with what you're doing?
No, I don't want to be found or followed. Look, I'm head down in a doctoral project at the moment. I'm on Instagram. I used to share lots of stuff about throwing tennis balls at people and shiny lights and fucking shit like that. I'm on Twitter, which is where most of the good conversations happen around skill acquisition, give or take a couple of trolls. But anyway, that's Twitter, or X as it is now. But that's where I am, John Mackey 14, or John Mackey on Instagram. Drop in and say hello.
And Scott, you?
Oh, I never get fed up with my own voice. No, I'm just fucking with you. But I'm a coach at Primal with my partner Ben Schultz, Primal MKE in Milwaukee. 5 years in of trying, for better or worse, to embrace the ecological approach. I have a podcast called the Primal MMA Coaching Podcast, where I speak to guests like Sean Mishka, John, Rob Gray's going to be coming on here soon. So I'm always very, very receptive because the community and my mentors have been very, very receptive to me. So if anyone wants to reach out, tell me I'm full of shit or inquire about what we're doing, I'm completely up for that too. And I'm not on Twitter that much. I'm on the dollar store Twitter now, which is Threads.
Nice. Perfect. All right, thanks guys for coming on and chatting and debating this topic. And we'll see you again, I'm sure, for the fourth appearance for you guys at some point.
Much love, Scott. Hope you're well, mate, and I'll see you soon.
You too. All right. Thanks, boys.
Take care, guys.